In this video I am going to give a brief overview of the different volumetric shaders. First I am going to activate the screencast keys, so that you can see which keys I am pressing throughout the course. We are not going to need the default cube, so we can delete this object with the X key. Instead of the cube, we are going to use the Suzanne object, which happens to be a monkey head. Now we are going to give Suzanne a subdivision modifier. Note that you can also leave the modifier unapplied if you wish to change the settings later on. By enabling smooth shading, we make our monkey more shiny. In the Properties panel, I am just going to collapse some tabs for better readability. Then, with Suzanne selected, I am going to change the Z location to 1 so that she rests on the grid. Now we are going to duplicate Suzanne to move it to another layer. Now we duplicate Suzanne again and move her to layer 3. Now we select the camera and sun lamp and move them to another layer as well. Now we set our viewport to another layer to add a plane object. Then we scale the plane with the S key. Now we are going to create another window with the node editor. In the node editor, we are going to create and edit our shader and procedural textures. Now we go back to our first layer to give a volumetric shader to our first Suzanne. We add in the beginning the default shader via the Properties editor. This will assign a simple gray diffuse shader to our object. To make more space on our screen, I am going to collapse the toolbar with the T hotkey. But before that, we are just going to check how the Suzanne looks like with the default shader material. We can select the layers marked in a darker shade. Then we can change the viewport render settings to cycles. Below you then see the cycles preview render in real time. You can change the amount of render samples in the Properties render panel. When you increase the preview render samples, your preview render will have less noise but takes longer to render. Notice that the preview rendering refreshes after each change in the viewport. Here you can see the amount of samples. I have my GPU rendering enabled for faster rendering. Now we will start working on the shader in the node editor. In this course we will only work on the shaders in the node editor. In the node editor you can also add new nodes with the keys Shift A, and we choose the volume scatter shader node. We can connect the shaders with the material output via the green connectors. Now the diffuse shader we are not going to need, so we can just disconnect it from the material output. You will notice the immediate change in the viewport render. You can modify the window border for the viewport rendering with Shift plus B key. We can also change the color of the shader, but notice that the RGB value gets reversed. But we can just leave it to its default color for now, but feel free to experiment. In this course we are actually not going to use the volume scatter shader, but I wanted to show you anyway, because it is a volumetric shader. Now we are going to our second layer, where our second Suzanne is positioned. With the Suzanne on the second layer selected, we will add a new material from within the Properties editor. Automatically with the creation of the material, the basic diffuse shader node and the material output node are added in the node editor. We then delete the diffuse node and add the volume absorption node. Then we can connect the volume absorption node with the volume socket of the material output node and check out the preview render. Here you can see the render samples progress. You can also rotate while cycles viewport rendering is enabled, but be aware that it then renders the whole window. You can change the density to increase the thickness of the volume absorption shader. With the volume absorption shader, you will notice that the light does not bounce off the monkey as seen with the volume scatter shader. So basically this volume shader absorbs the light depending on the density value. I advise you to play around with the volume scatter and absorption shader. However, for this course and its projects, we are not going to use these two shaders. For this course, we are going to work with the volume emission shader. This shader will also be used in all the projects that we are going to do. Now we are going to add a new material to the monkey on the third layer and delete the Vault Diffuse shader in the node editor with the X key. We will then add the emission shader and connect the socket with the surface output, which we are actually not going to use. But I wanted to show you the difference with the surface and the volume material output with our emission shader. Here you can see that the surface is emitting the light. Of course, you can change the colors and emission strength to increase the light emitted from Suzanne. When we switch the connector to the volume output, you can see the immediate change. You can now see that the light is emitted from the volume of the object and not from the surface. If you increase the strength too much, you will of course not notice any difference between the volume and the surface output. Now we are going to select all layers after having rearranged the monkeys so that we can easily see the difference between the different volumetric shaders. We can then select a different render border with the hotkeys Shift B. Now you can see the differences in the volumetric shaders more easily. You can decrease or increase the amount of preview render samples according to your needs. With the first monkey selected, we can increase the density to more clearly see how light behaves hitting the object. We can do the same for the second monkey with the volume absorption shader. You can even select objects while being in Cycle's preview render mode. You can see here that the volume scatter shader of the first monkey bounces off light and scatters it in different directions. The second monkey with the volume absorption shader only absorbs light and does not bounce back any light. Now we can experiment a little bit with the volume scatter shader. First we can snap the 3D cursor to our first monkey with the Shift S key. Then we can add a point light inside the monkey. Now we can play with the strength of the lamp emission and with the density of the volume scatter shader to see how the shader behaves. Of course, with more elements in the scene such as lights and objects, the preview render time will increase. Therefore I decrease the size of my preview render border. Here I quickly switch to wireframe view to see and select my point lamp again. You can also change the color or emission strength of the lamp in the node editor as well. Here I just copy the selected lamp with the Shift D key and move it on the other side inside the brain of our monkey. We can change the color so that our monkey gets a police brain. Now I will hide the monkey with the H key, and with the two lamps selected I move them to their separate layer. You can unhide objects with the Alt H key. Here I am just playing with the density to see how the density is blocking the light of the point lamps. If we now select our second monkey head on the second layer with the volume absorption shader, you will see that the light does not bounce inside the monkey head. With the third monkey head selected and moved over to the lamps, we can see that the light of the lamps does not affect the shader, since it has an emission shader itself. I urge you to experiment with the volume scatter and absorption shader to see what effects you can achieve. A combination of these two shaders are also used to create smoke and fire effects. But however, we are not going to cover that in this course. In the next lecture, I will teach you how to create your first volumetric sphere using the emission shader in the volume output. Thanks for watching and see you in the next video.